Thank you all for your attention and focus. Can you hear me?
Great. For your attention and focus all morning long. I'm so impressed with everyone still in the room. Standing between you and a delicious lunch is this discussion, so we'll be very succinct and on point. And boy, do we have a lot to talk about. I'm really excited for this closing panel today, talking about global health security generally and some of the big initiatives underway. Atul, I'm very excited to chat with you. The last time we spoke was 2 years ago at a FP Global Health Forum, and you were brand new to USAID. I'd love to chat about some of the things that you've learned over that time period. It's been tumultuous, and you've just launched the US Global Health Security Strategy. Would love to talk about that. Dr. Nishtar, Sania, if I may, thank you so much for joining us. You're brand new at Gavi, so we'd love to hear a little bit more about what you've discovered in your first few months on the job and the 5-year plan that you're rolling out, of course, for Gavi going forward. But Roland, we'd love to start with you. It's been a tumultuous week or two focused on the pandemic treaty. You are, of course, the person who sits on as a co-chair of the intergovernmental negotiating body. And we want to talk to you a little bit about what has happened with the pandemic treaty and next steps. But I wanted to reflect on one of my favorite programs recently. Many of you may have watched it. It's called The Three-Body Problem on Netflix. Familiar with that one? A fantastic story and a fantastical story of humanity faced with an alien invasion. But the key element of it is that the aliens aren't going to, they're light years away. They're not going to invade for a couple hundred years. So we have a long time to work together and plan our mutual defense, share intelligence, share tools, the West and the global South, so that we can, as one united humanity, defend the Earth. Does that sound familiar? It doesn't work in the show either, by the way. So we're not going to spoil any of your endings. I don't think I've killed that for anyone. But I didn't come up with that analogy, by the way. That was written by Luke McDonough, who is a law professor at the London School of Economics, and he wrote a piece for FP called "Blocking a Fair WHO Pandemic Accord Endangers Humanity," and that without an equitable agreement, including wealthy nations sharing IP with poorer nations, the world is doomed to repeat its COVID-era mistakes. We published that 10 days ago. For those of you watching online, you can see the link on our site, but please do visit fp.com and read it. It's a worthwhile read. So not sharing doom and gloom as much as here's where we are. You've spent a lot of time on this, Roland, and as we just discussed, we came into this week knowing where the treaty was. What I'd love to hear is a little bit more about what you think the next steps are. Is this something that we have to restart? Are we midstream right now? Is it something that can get done? What happens next?
Is this working?
I think so.
Well, firstly, thank you for spoiling my flight back home, because I was actually going to watch the 3rd episode of The Three-Body Problem. But I'll do that anyway, because I trust that it has some learningful experiences for our work in pandemic prevention and preparedness as well. We've been working on this for the last 2 years plus, and we started with this work in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, because we all felt that it was the logical thing to do. We were all in a situation which we hardly had ever encountered, that there was a disease spreading around the world. It's not just in Africa or somewhere else, but it was really everywhere. And it was occupying our minds in all countries of the world. So it made so much sense to come up with an ambitious framework, legal framework to better cooperate. And we started with a blank sheet of paper, and people forget that. And if you see where we are now, that is far beyond the blank sheet of paper. We have the whole story written out on paper. I think all the elements that matter to pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response are written down, and people might say, oh, this is not committing enough, or this is not strong enough. But I think that all the critical elements are in there, but we just did not have enough time to really agree upon them and finish them. And why is that? Because some of the issues in there are sticky, especially on the crossroads between public health and economics, public health and human rights, public health and trade, public health and, so many issues where there's a cross-cutting connection between public health and other fields of interest. And we just did not have the time to solve them all, actually. And that is not surprising, but it may be disappointing for people who are a bit further away from such processes, but normally they could take 5 to 6 or 7 years, and we try to do it in just over 2 years. And that has proved to be too ambitious. So now, as we speak, at the World Health Assembly, countries need to decide on the next steps. And I really cannot believe that there will be any other outcome than a continuation of the process. The only question is, for how long? Will we try to do it in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year? That's the discussion, I think. And let's see where that will bring us.
Thank you for sharing. And I just want to reconfirm that I did not ruin the program for you. You'll get a lot out of it after episode 3, three-body problem. What if you were to do over again, starting with that blank slate and a compressed timeline, which everyone would agree with? What kind of thing do you think we could have addressed and people that we could have brought to the table either sooner or better? There's so much discussion around public-private partnerships. We were just discussing this in a few previous panels. Could the private sector have been engaged more fully at the table earlier on? How are we going to overcome this key critical element around IP, which seems insurmountable? We have Lois Pace here talking about this a little bit earlier. How do you address that and get at it? And what could we have done earlier on in this process?
Well, it's obvious that for those kind of issues you need a private sector, and the private sector is an ally in getting there. That's, at least for me, that's pretty obvious. And we've spoken to them, and they've spoken out as well, and they've also indicated that they're willing to consider set-asides, for example. But they also said, and that's their good right to say that they feel that intellectual property rights should be upheld as much as possible. And well, that's just a given. But I think this is what we try to do, is create a treaty between 194 countries around the world. And then it's not easy to bring in the private sector in those discussions, because countries want to be in control of what they decide. And you can bring in private parties as advisors or partners, whatever, but not, it's just in the way we do things now, it's not possible to bring them in on the table and be equal to countries who are going to sign this. It's just not the format we work in. And would it be better? Well, that's another thing, but it's just not what we do.
Right, okay. And time is of the essence, of course. You have, and I know you're not telling us any specific timelines. Will it take 1 to 2 years, hopefully not 6 or 7? How much time will this take, do you think, is in your best estimate? I know there were discussions around that this week. What can you share?
Well, firstly, it's not up to me. It's up to all those countries in the World Health Assembly to decide upon a timeline. But I think that something between a half year and a year, we should be able to do it. And like I said, we have all the elements. We all know all the critical aspects to be decided upon to do this. But I think that maybe, that's my own interpretation of things, that expectations were sometimes risen too high. And like if this treaty is there, then all those problems around pandemics will be gone. And that's of course not what's going to happen. It is like what Mike Ryan from WHO said. It's just a starting point. It's a platform. It's a structure for further cooperation between countries. And let's see that it's unique that 194 countries say to each other, preventive policies, One Health, those are critical elements, and we should work on them. But do always in the understanding that there are countries out there that do not have the capacities yet to do that, so they need to be helped. But don't think that everything should be full-fledged at the moment that this treaty is signed. It's a starting point to improve the world in the next 25 years.
And what seems to be encouraging is that the will is there, so
yes.
These problems can be solved.
Yes, but at the same time you see that it's maybe difficult for some countries. To give you the example of the set-asides, the percentages of vaccines that should be put aside by the pharmaceutical industry to be shared with countries in most need. Well, that's a very sensitive issue, as you can imagine, because that is something you say to private partners, you shall be setting aside a certain percentage. They do that on a voluntary basis because they also believe in the system, but that's very unique. And but if you if you need to come home and say that they should be setting aside 20%, for example, and it's only 5, then that might be a disappointment. And again, I think you should not look at it that way. You should look at it as a starting point for cooperation. So if every country, and this is just one example, and they are across the board with all countries in the north, west, east, south, they all have those kind of issues that they expect from this. But if you keep up those expectations too high, and you run the risk of being disappointment that it's not that yet, then it's going to be difficult to agree upon. But if you all see this is a starting point, like I said, then it can be done within half a year to a year.
Great. Better living through low expectations, my mother always told me, so that is a good word to live by, I would say. Sania, would love to move over to you and bring you into the conversation. As mentioned, you've only recently taken the helm of Gavi at a critical time. You know, we're talking about this right now. Would love to hear how it's going, your experiences with this, and if you could, move into the 5-year plan that you've developed for Gavi as well. Please do share.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and it's great to see so many friends around the room. I'm 9 weeks into the role, brand new, and it's felt like moving on a jumping train because the organization is at a very important inflection point. I have our respected board member on my left side who will bear me out. We are on the road to what we call replenishment. It's in our parlance, it's the name for our fundraising drive. We're fundraising for the strategy period 2026 to 2030, and alongside we are also shaping a new strategy, an ambitious strategy. It's taken Gavi to immunize 1 billion children in 24 years since it's been an inception. And our aspiration is to vaccinate the next 1 billion in half that time. So we're preparing for that. And part of my role as an incoming CEO is to prepare us for that accelerated phase. And in that accelerated phase, there are new vaccines in the market with no shortage of supply, vaccines such as the human papillomavirus vaccine, the first against cancer, transformative potential. There is the malaria vaccine with no shortage of supply, and there is the tuberculosis vaccine on the anvil, and all this alongside the routine childhood vaccines, which is very much the bread and butter of what we do. So many vaccines and others on the anvil, an ambition to vaccinate the next 1 billion in half the time. But we are doing this against a backdrop of a very resource-constrained environment, where there are conflicts ongoing, with climate change is a reality. The traditional donors have their own macroeconomic challenges, many internal competing priorities. And of course, this is a world where the viability and the usefulness of the multilateral system is unfortunately being questioned. So it's a time of great transformation for the organization. And as the incoming CEO, I, of course, had to immediately jump on those two processes. And as any CEO of a large ship would, I've had to look internally, look at the HR matters, the financial matters, make a 6-month plan for myself, which has some very exciting components as well. The plan is in the final stages of being shaped up. I will take it to our board. My colleagues have to weigh in. And I think this is also a very exciting week for us, because we are looking at what's happening at the World Health Assembly. Our respected co-chair talked about the process, and we have to be optimistic about it, because the pandemic treaty actually has to provide the rules under which all of us are going to operate. That is going to be the overarching framework under the rubric of which we will play our respective roles. Gavi, for instance, the bulk of our work is routine immunization. But the system that we develop in that process is the system that is going to be leveraged when a pandemic happens. And we are very conscious as an organization that we have, for lack of a better expression, 4 different roles in that emergency scenario. One is, of course, the routine side of vaccination and building those rails, building that system which will allow us to deliver. The second is to have financing available on day one. And to that effect, my predecessors did a very good job of structuring an instrument called the Day Zero Financing Facility, which we've designed, we've structured, we've fundraised, set aside the money, and we will be taking it to our governing body for approval next week. The third role that we have to play within this framework is to learn lessons from what happened during COVID. And during COVID, there was a huge trust issue with regards to the access issues that the African continent faced. So as an organization, Gavi learned from that, and we've put together what is called the African Vaccine Manufacturing Accelerator, which is basically an advanced market commitment of $1 billion meant to act as a catalyst to signal to the industry that they must come forward and invest. That again has been structured. The money has been raised, put aside.
You're launching that in a few weeks' time.
We are launching it on the 20th of June in Paris. And again, the final structural modalities of that in terms of the governance, in terms of operations, in terms of treasury management is what our board is going to hopefully approve next week. And then the fourth part, which I think Gavi has to play, and again, let me re-emphasize, it's an ecosystem of actors, with the treaty being the overarching normative framework, with WHO as the steward, and many of us having different roles. We are one of the many. But the fourth important role, as the vaccine alliance that we play there, is to actually manage the vaccine platform in case of outbreaks and emergencies. Now, those outbreaks could be outbreaks where the pathogen is known, and we already have a stockpile. Mm-hmm. Those emergencies could be an outbreak where the pathogen is known, where the vaccine is registered in one country, but is not pre-qualified by WHO. And the current Mpox outbreak in DRC is a case in point. And in those situations, what is the role of Gavi? The third situation is where there's an outbreak and the pathogen is known, and the vaccine is very much in the upstream stages of development. So what does Gavi do to accelerate? And then there is a disease X situation. So I know you sitting up in your chair as a way of signaling to me that I should round up, and I will do in a second. So you know, as a presenter, you have to be very conscious about body language from the moderator, but
You're going to be a great CEO, I just want to say right now.
So just to close the loop, just to let you know that what you're doing is very important for us, because we are one small entity with, as a CEO, I look at our role in the pandemic landscape across 4 dimensions. And I want to have clarity on how we're going to play the role. So I'm going to make a control room with clear SOPs pasted on the wall, ready for us to move into the control room and switch on the light and know exactly what to do when WHO gives us the call as per the framework that you set in.
By the way, we could have gone on for a very long time there. You were doing great, but we only have a few minutes left. We'll move on to Atul.
And my board member can't.
So one of the key leadership roles that we all have, of course, is hiring smart, brilliant, driven people. So kudos, Atul. You've definitely done a great job there. And want to bring you in and talk a little bit about, first of all, as I mentioned, we last spoke 2 years ago. You were the new person at the helm then of USAID and the health strategy. This was a COVID conference we were having. Everyone in the audience was masked. Look at us now. Vaccines, again, playing an important role in that. And you wrote a fascinating piece, I thought, in the New York Times, I wish it was published in Foreign Policy, about how the world needs its own immune system. And I would love to talk to you a little bit more about what you mean on that, pull that thread, but also what you've learned in the past couple of years at USAID. You mentioned in that piece that you've just gone from crisis to crisis to crisis. Are we in a perma-crisis right now? And is that the normal state of affairs that we have to prepare for? Please tell us your thoughts.
Well, so
Yes, came in to help drive the response internationally on COVID, and then it turned out we've had 6 Ebola or Ebola-related outbreaks, so 3 Ebola outbreaks, and then the cousin of Ebola, Marburg virus, up to 90% mortality, no vaccine, no diagnostic, no treatment, and on top of that, Mpox, another public health emergency of international concern, and 30 cholera outbreaks, polio returning to Malawi and Mozambique to Africa. Yes, the pace of outbreaks are increasing, and so all the while that the pandemic negotiations is going on, in fact, the system has been evolving, and you are seeing ways in which our body has an immune system that detects threats, rapidly responds, and interestingly gets stronger with each subsequent threat as it builds its library of response. And that is exactly what has been happening in the global community as we go along. The system has learned. It is imperfect and there are continued challenges, but we do get stronger and better. And as a reflection on this, recall Ebola outbreaks were killing hundreds to thousands of people as recently as 2018. In the DRC, where that outbreak in 2018 killed north of 2,000 people, the responses in the year following that meant that instead of virus circulating for 4 months before detection, it was just 1 month, and it was 55 dead. And then in April of 23, it was just less than 48 hours to have a response, detection, and then follow that with a response, and it was 5 dead. That kind of extraordinary pace of change, that is because of international commitments, whether it was WHO, USAID, CDC, in particular making investments to strengthen laboratories, build emergency operations centers, control rooms going into organizations and governments all over the world. And we have played a critical role in the US government in trying to align with the world's views of where that response what it should look like. But what I would say is the strategy around the world is largely agreed upon. The work that is happening in the court is a lot more about how do you make it happen. The mechanics, who has what responsibilities and so on. And yet the whole way, what we now know is within 24 to 48 hours, we have to have sequenced any new virus or disease. And that is now increasingly happening. Tanzania was a Marburg outbreak just last year. A community health worker had been trained through programs like USAID's and CDC's in partnership with the Tanzanian government to recognize when illness in a local community doesn't look right. And that a community health worker went to a home and found that there were 2 deaths and that they didn't make sense. They understood how to protect themselves and not get infected. They called in an emergency response, and there was someone at the other end of that phone who was there within 48 hours. There was a mobile lab that was brought in to collect samples that included, that USAID had funded. That allowed for capturing of samples, initially thought to be Ebola, transported to a CDC-backed laboratory that played a critical role in identifying it was Marburg disease, and enabled a response where the government drove the response. This was not, hundreds or thousands of people swarming in from around the world. The government led a response that shut it down within days. And this is happening again and again and again as these negotiations go along. So I think the critical thing to understand is that this work is already happening, it is ongoing, and the negotiations are learning and changing because of what we learn as financing arrives, new financing vehicles like $2 billion that Gavi has now for pandemic response that they did not have with COVID.
Right, great, thank you.
Wow, well, I knew I needed more time for this panel. We're not even going to get to AI, which I was really excited to talk about. Let's end, that was a nice positive upswinging note. One thing that I wanted to ask really all three of you, if you could, 30 seconds, how do we find the political will that we need to make this stuff happen? It sounds like the desire's there. The mechanics are important, though, to get to Atul's point. You can't do it without the mechanics, even if there's the desire. I'm just curious if there's any, if what you've experienced this week helps you think about how you can pull together the political will to make these things happen and get folks on the same page. Maybe we could start with you, Atul.
Okay, I'll try and, there's 77 years now, this is the 77th meeting of the World Health Assembly, and during that time, the 50% of deaths in the world were occurring in children under 5 at the beginning of this story. Every year, there is difficulty reaching consensus. There are things we can get to consensus to, there are things we can't, and yet there is continued progress. And today, it is a world where, you know, we are closing in on a 70-year life expectancy, almost double the global life expectancy. Health is the one space where the demonstration of the value of cooperation among nearly 200 member states creates value. And the sausage making is never pretty, and yet there is steady progress. I see it here, just the fact that primary health care has now been accepted as a critical priority. 10 years ago, we were not there. Yeah. And now we recognize that as the most valuable way to create value in the system.
Love it. A great point. Sania, maybe we could go to you. Political will, something very important for Gavi, obviously, to manifest.
So my sense is that when you talk about political
Microphone,
will,
please.
I beg your pardon. My sense is that when you talk about political will, it's one thing to talk about an international agency. It's another thing to talk about a government. And if the frame of reference is a government, then as a former politician, I can tell you that you can only create political will by changing the framework of accountabilities. How many politicians, heads of states, and ministers have been held accountable for the loss of lives, for the children that die needlessly, for the mothers that die in childbirth, because their primary healthcare systems have hemorrhaging supply chains, are riddled with informal payments, and have primary healthcare systems that don't function. Unless you're going to make them accountable for outcomes in the social sector, things will not change for us.
Very good. Roland, you could probably teach a master class in political will after the past couple weeks.
30 seconds. But basically, I said it before, accept limitations, accept imperfections, and start working. I mean, what the colleagues already pointed out, we're not starting from scratch. A lot of things are just already in place. This is just building the framework around it and just start working instead of just emphasizing the differences between us. And that would be my main
focus on what is working. Agreed,
yes,
agreed.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Roland, Driece, Sania, Nishtar, Atul, Gawande. Please join me in thanking them. That's a wrap. Give me 2 minutes here, if I could please ask. You've been so patient. I must